Hello, I'm Olly and this is CriminOlly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, everything I read in November. November was a very enjoyable reading month for me, not least I suspect because I read quite a lot of books which could charitably be described as trash. I read some really shocking books this month. Shocking both in terms of not necessarily being that well written, but also shocking in terms of their content. But all of them were by and large really enjoyable. So definitely an entertaining month. It was also a month where I didn't really partake in any reading event, so I had quite a free rein to choose what I wanted to read this month. It was, of course, the first month of my Read What You Own challenge, which I managed to fail within just a few days. The reason for that is a book that I read during the month, which I'll show you in a minute. But I'm back on that horse again now, and on my second go at the 25-26 Read What You Own challenge, and enjoying it a lot. So I will go through the books I read in order, and then as usual I'll tell you at the end my favourite book of the month. And unusually I've already decided what it is. Normally I start filming this video without really knowing which book it's going to be, but this month I do know. So first book then was Cop Hater by Ed McBain, which I read for the 87th Precinct read along that I'm doing, so hosting on my Discord. This is the first book in the 87th Precinct series. I've read it a number of times. It's really great, a really good solid police procedural, a little bit of humour, some great kind of world building in terms of the description of the city it's set in, and introduces you to some of the characters who you come to know and love through the rest of the series. So really enjoyed it, and I think pretty much all the people who've taken part in the read along enjoyed it as well. If you want to take part, hop on my Discord. There's a link to that in the description to this video. You don't have to start with book one. You can start wherever you want to, and you can dip in and out should you want to, because there are 55 books in the series. But yeah, a reread for me, but one that I very much enjoyed. After that then, oops, I just chucked my copy of Cop Hater on the floor. After that then, I read the 11th book for the project where I'm buddy reading with my dad his 12 favourite books, so nearly finished that now. So this was Long Reach by Mike Lunnon-Wood. So this is a British military novel about an attack on Belize. So Belize is a country in Central America that the British have kind of ties to, and there's an agreement that the Brits will defend Belize if there's ever any trouble over there. And in this book there is trouble. Belize gets invaded by Guatemala, and some British troops who are over there on exercise have to defend. So you've basically got some locals, you've got some people like tourists who are over there, and you've got these British troops all trying to hold off the might of the Guatemalan army. It was a really fun read, really good kind of battle sequences and things like that, but really good characters too. And the thing that most impressed me about it was the depiction of the kind of everyday lives of members of the British military. He doesn't sugarcoat things at all, but the characters were all kind of really interesting, really vivid, quite memorable as well. So yeah, a very interesting and enjoyable read if you enjoy military style fiction. After that then, something that couldn't be more different, so I read Is Chelsea Going Blind by Alida E. Young. So this is a I think 1990s YA book, 1980s, 1986 YA book about this teenage girl, Chelsea, who starts to lose her sight, and it's just about how she deals with that. So Alida E. Young wrote a bunch of books about teenagers dealing with difficult issues. In December I'm going to read Is Daddy Dying by the same author. Oh no, it's not Is Daddy Dying, it's What's Wrong with Daddy. So yes, this was it was definitely cheesy. It was definitely an 80s YA book. It wasn't the best written book ever, but it was actually quite gripping and quite moving, and I did come to to care about Chelsea and what was happening to her. After that, I read Hide by Kiersten White. So this is one of the 10 books I said I wanted to read before the end of the year. So this is a kind of horror thriller. it starts like a thriller and it ends up being like a horror novel. And it was fun. It was an interesting read. It wasn't brilliant. It didn't grip me quite as much as I thought it would. I didn't get into the characters quite as much as I would have liked, but it was still a very entertaining read. So the setting is this abandoned amusement park where there's this competition that's run every year where a bunch of people, I can't remember how many it is, 14, get bought in and they have to hide during the day in the amusement park, and they gradually get picked off and they think that they're just being found and exiled from the park, but of course they're not. They're being brutally murdered. So it was a fun read, and the when you find out what's going on, I thought that was actually really well done and really clever. The whole kind of backstory and the concept behind this competition I thought was great. So there's a lot to like about this book. It just wasn't quite as well executed as I might have liked it to be. After that then, the book that broke my Read What You Own challenge. So this is a book I actually read before breaking the Read What You Own challenge. So I had a digital copy of it. I read that, and then when I was looking it up online to research it, I completely accidentally found a very affordable copy on eBay. And this is a book that's really hard to get hold of for less than, kind of 50, 60 quid. So I'm going to have to censor the cover, as I have in all my videos where I've showed it so far. So the book is The Gas by Charles Platt, which is a 1970s science fiction, like erotic science fiction novel, I suppose you would call it. So the concept here is, rather like James Herbert's The Fog, there's this gas that kind of creeps across the United Kingdom, but rather than sending people like violently mad like The Fog does, it makes people incredibly horny. And so basically the book is, it's structured like a kind of 50s disaster, like science fiction disaster movie type thing, with scientists trying to figure out what's going on and so on and so forth, but punctuated all the way through with increasingly graphic sexual scenes, some of which are quite disturbing in their kind of content. So a very strange and interesting book. It's quite funny at times. There's definite kind of vein of black humour and satire running through it. It's not hard to see that Charles Platt, who was English, wasn't a huge fan of English society. So an interesting book, but probably not for everyone. I did do a full review of that one. Next up then, a book by a fellow booktuber. So this is Managing and Other Lies by Willow Heath, host of the channel Willow Talks Books. This is a really interesting short story collection, very different from everything else I've read this month, in that it is quite experimental in the style of the stories. So there are lots of different like ways of telling stories that Willow uses in this book. There's one story, for example, that is laid out like a play. There's some poetry. There's all sorts of different things, but all of the stories have a horror element to them, which I really enjoyed. There's some interesting kind of discussion of like, I suppose, queer identity and things like that, and it's just overall an interesting and like worth reading first book. I'm interested to see what Willow does next. Not all of the stories were perfect, but it's definitely a book that has something to say, and I enjoyed reading it. After that then, the book that I read for the CriminOlly book club this month, so the book club I run for my patrons and channel members, that was Bat Eater and Other Names for Cora Zeng by Kylie Lee Baker. So this was a horror novel with an interesting setting and a lot that was really good about it. I found that it kind of struggled a little bit, or I struggled a little bit with it in the middle, but by the end I was really enjoying it. So it's an interesting mix of kind of humour and horror, and also like commentary on the lives of Asian Americans. So it's about this woman, Cora Zeng, who's an Asian American, and it's set during COVID. So she is subject to a lot of racism from her fellow Americans around the source of the supposed source of the COVID pandemic. And there's also a strong kind of supernatural element running through it as well. It kind of taps into Asian folklore and things like that. So there was a lot going on in this book, and there's a lot that I really, really liked about it. But I felt like the tone and things like that didn't always quite work for me. So if you like the sound of it, you'll probably enjoy it, but it wasn't, for me, a perfect read. After that then, I read another book by Charles Platt. This one, in fact, turned out to be even more difficult to get hold of than The Gas, albeit I've had this copy sat on my bookshelf behind me for quite a while. I got it cheap off eBay some time ago. So this is Sweet Evil. So this is another 1970s book by Platt. This edition of it is actually a rewritten edition, so he completely rewrote it for a German translation in, I think, like the 2000s, and then it got republished in English as well. And this is a kind of brutal, transgressive road movie kind of a book. So about this couple who go on a spree of violence and sexual violence across the States. So definitely has a very 70s vibe to it. And it was interesting. It was very interestingly structured in that there's a framing device to it, which I imagine was added for this new edition and wasn't in the original, where the main character is looking back on the events of the book. And there's another book I read this month that does the same thing. So that gave it a really interesting kind of sense of perspective. It's a very brutal book at times, but I found it really interesting, really readable. And it was one of those books where even though you weren't like rooting for the central characters, you really, really wanted to know what was going to happen. Okay, up next, something that's definitely trashy, Hellfire by Leo Kessler. So Leo Kessler is the pseudonym of a British writer whose name I always forget to write down before starting to film one of these videos, and I've done that again. I think it might have been Duncan something. So this is a World War II thriller. He wrote a series of these books, cashing in on the success of the books by an author called Sven Hassel, which were about kind of German soldiers and Axis soldiers, should we say, during the Second World War. This is about a German, what is he? Is he a lieutenant? A colonel, an SS colonel who at the end of the war escapes to Africa. And it was just a fun wartime read, some good action sequences, lots of tension, and just the central character was genuinely interesting to read as well. So definitely a trashy book, but one that I enjoyed. After that, some more trash. So an early Shaun Hutson book, The Skull. So Shaun Hutson, one of my favourite horror authors, and has been since I was a teenager, but I'd never read this one somehow, despite the fact that it came out when I was really into Shaun Hutson, or just before I got into him, I guess. So this is not the best, not his best book, and it's the reason it's not his best book, or not one of his best books to be fair, is that it's reasonably tame. The thing that Hutson does really well in his books is just go wild. Just throw everything he can at the reader and make his books as violent and disgusting as possible. And he doesn't really do that in The Skull. So it's about this couple. The wife is like an archaeologist, and the husband is a building contractor who's trying to build this mansion during a period of terrible rain. He discovers this skull. Or I'm trying to remember, there's basically two skulls in this book, rather confusingly. There's one that gets discovered which is like a shrunken head inside a bottle, and there's another one which is a weird kind of animal-human hybrid skull. Anyway, they discover these skulls and weird stuff starts happening. It's all a bit creepy. There's a few deaths and things like that, and a little bit of sex as well, as you always get in a Shaun Hutson book. But yeah, it just didn't hit the heights of something like The Slugs for me. Moving on then, some more trash, and after I talked about this on the channel, Bob Dice, one of my patrons, pointed out that this book is actually written by one of my favourite authors, and I hadn't realised. So this is The Revenger, Book 5, The Rainbow Coloured Shroud by Joseph Hedges. Now the name Joseph Hedges should have made me realise who this was by. So Josiah Hedges is the hero of the Edge books, which I have talked about on the channel many times, which I'm gradually working my way through. So this book was actually written by Terry Harknett, who, as what's his name, George G. Gilman, wrote the Edge books. So this is a kind of trashy men's adventure type book. It was written apparently to provide something for the British market when Corgi lost the rights to publish the Executioner books over here. So they had originally been publishing them when Don Pendleton was writing them, and then Gold Eagle, the American company, got involved and kind of bought the rights, and I think they weren't able to publish them anymore, so they wanted an equivalent series. So Terry Harknett wrote this series. I don't think there's that many, but I really want to read the rest of them, and they are all available cheaply digitally. So once I've finished my Read What You Own challenge, I shall probably get some more of these. it was really, really fun. So it's a very British men's adventure type story. There's a lot of like bad humour in it. There's quite a lot of sex in it, far more sex than you get in the Executioner books. So it's got that kind of sleazy British 70s vibe to it. But there's also like a real Britishness to the central character. So whenever he like beats up a bad guy or kills a bad guy, he tells them, you know, you got what you deserved, mate, or something like that. So there's a load of kind of British type slang in it that I found very, very entertaining, and it was like a decent enough story as well. So basically, from what I can gather, in the first book, the hero's girlfriend gets killed by this kind of shadowy international crime syndicate. In this one, he's going up against their Scandinavian arm, which is involved in making pornography. So he basically kills a load of pornographers. So yeah, a very entertaining men's adventure book. If you like Terry Hartnett's Edge books and you haven't read this series, I definitely recommend it. Next up then, the trashiest book of the month, another book I'm going to have to slightly censor, Dragonard by Rupert Gilchrist. So I did do a review of this on the channel, calling it the most racist book I've ever read, and it really is. The first in a series. I've discovered since making that video, thanks to Eerie, one of my long-time subscribers, that Rupert Gilchrist is a pseudonym for a guy called Peter Menegas, I think, who wrote a few different books during the 70s and 80s, including some kind of horror type stuff. But I think, I'm guessing he was commissioned by the publisher, who apparently also published some of his other books, the American publisher did, to write this. So this is a plantation novel, so set in St. Kitts in the Caribbean, about a British guy who goes over there to make a living from the slave trade. So an incredibly brutal book, absolutely packed with sex and violence, horribly racist, and yet really like very readable. A very enjoyable is the wrong word, but it was a page turner. I really wanted to find out what was going to happen. So I will be, to my great shame, I will be reading more books in this series. After that then, a book I've been meaning to read for a while, and I can't remember if I had read this before. I kind of thought I had when I was a teenager, but when I read it, like nothing was triggered in terms of memories about it. So it's Psycho 2 by Thomas Bloch, which is different from the Psycho 2 movie. So in this one, Norman Bates escapes 15 years after the events of the first Psycho, escapes from the mental institution where he's been imprisoned, and goes on a kind of cross-country rampage. His target being a film company that is making a film that is based on the events of Psycho. So the terrible murders that happened in the first book, they're making a dramatized movie version of it. It definitely isn't as good as Psycho. It's definitely disappointing after Psycho, because Psycho is such a great book. But it was still fun, had some interesting ideas. You get to revisit a number of characters from the first book, and it had a really, really good twist at the end. So I did enjoy it. Next up then, we are nearly there, 3 books to go. So next up is The Bottoms by Joe R Lansdale. Again, I've done a review of this on the channel. This was fantastic. So a Depression era crime novel set in Texas about the investigation into the murder of a local black woman, and it turns out like a string of similar murders. So a serial killer operating in the area, but all told through the eyes of a young boy who's the person who discovers the body in the first place. So just packed full of atmosphere and, a wonderful depiction of Texas during the 1930s. Really interesting characters. And again, like Sweet Evil, a book where the central character is, at the start of the book, is an old man in an old people's home, and he's looking back on the events of the book. So gives it that extra sense of perspective. I thought this was a really, really fantastic mystery novel, but also just a book that has a lot to say about racism and racial justice, and was just a really gripping and enjoyable read. Right, next up we have Cruel Space by Herbert Lieberman, a book I've been meaning to read for years, which wasn't quite what I was expecting, but was still really good. So I expected a kind of fairly straightforward suspense novel, and this is actually more of a kind of psychological investigation. It's one of those books where kind of slightly out of the ordinary things happen, and you spend quite a lot of your time trying to figure out exactly why the characters have done what they've done and where things are going to lead. So this is about an elderly retired couple who take into their home a young man who comes initially to like service their oil tank that they've got to heat the house, and ends up after that, rather than leaving the house, hiding in their basement. And that after a while they are a childless couple and they've kind of always wanted a child, and they end up semi-adopting him, but he is someone with a bit of a past, quite a strange individual, quite a damaged individual. So where the book goes is to some fairly dark places, but it was a really interesting and gripping read, and really thoughtful. Herbert Lieberman kind of takes this scenario and then just runs with it, and you almost feel like he's not making it up as he goes along exactly, but exploring with you, the reader, what might happen next. So I thought it was very interesting. And then finally, something of a disappointment, which surprised me. So Patricia Highsmith's Little Tales of Misogyny. So as you know, if you've watched the channel for a while, I'm a huge fan of Patricia Highsmith. Over the last couple of years, I've read all of her novels and really enjoyed the vast majority of them. This short story collection I didn't like nearly as much as any of her novels, I don't think. So the stories are really short and really sparse, and I just felt like I wasn't getting something to really hook my teeth into with them. So you get a small cast of characters and you get a situation, and then she just tells you what happens. But I never felt like I was really invested in the events of these stories. There are a couple that are slightly longer that I enjoyed a bit more, but these stories kind of feel a bit like fairy tales in a way, in that you feel a bit detached from what's going on in them. So some interesting concepts in here, but I didn't love it overall. Right, that is me done. Fortunately, my favourite book of the month is near the top of the pile, and that is The Bottoms by Joe R Lansdale. Thanks again, Heidi. So Heidi, one of my patrons, sent me this copy a while ago. I had bought a copy from a second-hand book sale in a local supermarket, and it's completely falling apart. So Heidi sent me a non-falling apart copy. She is a huge Joe R Lansdale fan, and rightly so, because he's a fantastic author. I forgot to say in my review of this that when you search him up on Google, he's described not just as an author, but as an author and martial arts tutor. So I believe he has a martial arts studio, as well as being a fantastic author, which I think is pretty cool. So anyway, this is my book of the month. Absolutely fantastic. Definitely highly recommended. Anyway, hope you all had fantastic reading months in November as well. Do let me know what you've been reading in the comments. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.